However, it's going to sound fortissimo. Notice that we have a very active bass line, right? Think about Bach. Welcome back to Composition and its Allies. My name is Barney. I'm a classical composer, and this is a channel for composers as well as performers interested in composition. In today's episode of Orchestration for Composers, I will orchestrate a climax. Let's begin. This is an excerpt from my first symphony, HELPISONTHEWAY for orchestra. Today we're going to focus on what I call working backwards and forwards. So when you're orchestrating, what you're going to find, you want to work on a certain section, but you can't work on it totally out of context. You have to know what's happening afterwards as well as before. It's very similar if you've composed a fugue, add a little bit here, you got to take away a little bit there. So let's go ahead and orchestrate what happens afterwards. Here we have parallel first inversion chords. Notice that I put them in the woodwinds. So when you're orchestrating any kind of parallel chords, you want the harmony to be very intelligible. And the most obvious way to do that is to put it all in one group. Notice that the top line is in the oboe and the bottom two lines is in the clarinet. So you're kind of bringing out one of the voices. If you wanted this to be more homogeneous, you could have the flute on the top line and two clarinets below. All right, so we orchestrated what happens after the climax. Now we want to make sure that we can actually get into it. So notice that this chord here, the C sharp, we're in F sharp minor, so it's kind of feel like a dominant, okay? And then the chord we're getting to is a first inversion A major chord. So the enchaînement, we say in French, the connection works really well. And of course, orchestration is harmony. Notice that the woodwinds are absent in this chord, and then they're present in the new fresh harmony, the new section, okay? Also, another thing is we have lots of low brass and low strings. Depending on how high the climax is prior, we may want more or less because maybe we want more contrast or we want it to sound equal in volume. But the most important is that I figured out that we're not going to have the woodwinds so that they sound fresh. Now let's go ahead to the beginning. All right, so notice that we have a background and the melody gets placed on top. So in the background, we have treble and we have bass. The treble background is clarinet and violin 2, and the bass background is cello and bassoon. A very good orchestration principle is for mezzo forte and less in volume, you only need one solo woodwind instrument per string section. So in this particular case, it is one clarinet to violin 2s. Now, obviously that will change depending on the range or the register or the intensity, but it's a good principle to start with. Then we have the bassoons and the cellos, which pair really well together. Notice that the bassoon is not in a low, dark, honky range. It's in a very nondescript register, so it's going to blend really well. Let's look at breathing and spacing. So notice that the clarinets are alternating. We have second clarinet alternating with the first clarinet. This is so that there's a nice continuous sound. Then we have the violins, which are slurred in a different manner from the clarinets. Okay, and this again is to have continuity of sound so that we don't notice any breaks in the sound. It's really these micro details that are going to make the orchestration, because you have to remember you may not have a second performance or even a first performance. So as much as possible, if you can have it sound excellent out of the box, is better. All right. Then we have the melody. All right, we have oboes and trumpets at the unison. Generally, I would say when you're orchestrating, it usually makes more sense to have oboes and trumpets at the octave, having the oboes above the trumpets. Okay, but in here, I was looking for a certain sound. Notice that the oboes are in the low honky register where they can really project. They're also on intervals, fourths and fifths, that really sound strong. Trumpets are marked mezzo forte compared to oboes forte, and trembles are also mute. So definitely here we're going to hear the oboe as the prominent sound. Now let's compare the melody to the background. So the melody is very much kind of this brassy, kind of honky, angular sound. And the background is very fluid, clear, more pure timbres. Notice everyone's in a very medium register, nondescript register. Finally, we have the bass. Now, when it comes to the double bass, I think almost always you need to have the double bass doubled, either at the unison or at the octave. I just don't find that the sound independent of that, it's not even an issue of projection. It's just very fuzzy. It just doesn't, it's not totally appetizing for the ear. I would suggest studying Debussy's Pelléas and Mélisande for Symphony opera to really look at the possibilities for doubling with the bass. So I would say look at that score and notice where he is doubling the bass, double bass, or where he's not. Notice what instruments he's doubling it with. Many times it's not going to be the cellos. And also notice if it's at the octave or if it's at the unison. Here the double bass is doubled at the octave with the timpani. Notice the double bass is pizzicato and two bass only and pianissimo. So one of the reasons it's marked two basses only is because low strings in the low register, when they're doing pizzicato, it really sucks up the attention, right? It's a very attractive sound. It's a plump, fat sound, but it really draws a lot of attention. So be careful. So I have it pianissimo and two basses only to start. And notice that I have the timpani, the octave higher, with a staccato so it can align with the pizzicato sound. So we've orchestrated what happens after the climax. We've orchestrated what's happening before. So we have a proper context. Certainly these sections can and will be updated and revised a little bit, but we at least have a clear idea of what we're working with. Now, climaxes usually last for a certain amount of time. Okay, and you want to divide up the work. So this particular climax is about 40 seconds, I'd say, and it consists of two phrases. I would highly suggest is figuring out what are the phrases. Okay, that's kind of the most elemental level we'll work at in orchestration. Sometimes, of course, you do have a chord, you focus a lot on the chord, but generally, like as a conscious task, I would say the phrase level is how small I would usually go. So the first phrase notice that there's basically two different elements. There's the foreground, and then there's the background. Something to note is here at measure 58, notice that we don't have any foreground. What does that mean? It means that you might want to orchestrate this first. Make sure that the background is going to sound excellent and sufficient in the absence of that foreground. And then once you're satisfied to go a measure prior, orchestrate, keep that same orchestration, but add the foreground. Another possibility is that you may need to just change the orchestration when the foreground isn't absent, so voices might have to go up or down. In this particular case, the music is moving rather rapidly, and I think it'd be kind of clumsy to just suddenly change the orchestration, though there are times it can work. So I'm going to make sure that the orchestration is excellent, both when the bass isn't present, as well as when it's all tutti. The second phrase starts here. And notice that we have a crescendo. In general, a tutti passage is very expensive on your time because you have to work a lot with the balance, of the octave or the unison, adding or taking away, but also when there's a crescendo. Because when there's a crescendo, you have to think about the in and out points. You have the start. Before the crescendo, you have the kind of the middle, and then you have the end point. So you may need to update the orchestration as you go, or just choose something that's going to work the entire time. So that said, let's go ahead and orchestrate the first phrase first. Now, a common problem I find that I had composing my first symphony, orchestrating it in particular, is not knowing what I want, right? Like you have a lot of ideas and the melodies, usually you have an idea, but when you're composing at the piano, you kind of have sketches of your ideas, but the orchestration you're hearing might be fuzzy. What I find, especially for Tutti, because there's so many instruments, what I find has worked really, really well is to not taking orchestration classes. I think orchestration classes is really helpful for orchestration. It just kind of speeds up certain things. I don't think they're essential. I think what definitely is essential, besides harmony, which is a whole nother story, is to hear live music. I will say from personal experience, when I was living in Paris, when I was revising the symphony, is I was going to the opera a lot, hearing live opera. And opera is a lot of music, like 3 hours of continuous music, except for the intermission. And what I found is like the next day when I went to work on HELPISONTHEWAY, the symphony, I found, my hearing was much, much, much sharper. And continually, as I was orchestrating this work and having difficulty sometimes hearing certain things, I found if I happened to have been to live performance recently, the hearing was sharper, okay? So if you're not sure what is the timbre you're hearing, what I would suggest is like, what is the central timbre? So in this particular passage, it's definitely very low brass heavy. I was hearing that when I was composing at the piano for sure. So I would orchestrate the low brass. Now we have tuba, double an octave higher by 2 trombones, and 1 trombone on the fifth. This is parallel fifth chords, and much like the previous example of parallel sixth chords, you got to keep it in the same group, and you don't want to break it up. You want it very easy to understand. I don't think we need much fifth because, the root is really the focus. So I only had 1 voice on the fifth, but you have to use your own ear. Now, you might think, and certainly an amateur, nothing wrong with being an amateur, but an amateur, like, okay, let me just finish up the orchestrating the melody, get it all done. Be careful. You don't want to over-orchestrate or orchestrate in a vacuum, because if I focus just on this melody, get the perfect orchestration, but don't consider the context, what'll probably happen is there won't be enough room for the other voices, right? We have 4 other lines. So what I would suggest now is going on to another line, orchestrating that, and then coming back and filling in. When you're orchestrating, it's very rare that you're going to get 1 measure done in completion or 1 section. Many times you get bits and pieces. It's like getting different clues. Okay, so in this particular case, I'm going to get the treble texture. This comes from an esprit, as we say in French, okay, or a mindset from harmony. You have the bass and you have the soprano. So notice that I started prior to the actual climax. There's a couple of reasons for this. First off, practically, it'd be strange to just start in the middle of measure 53 where the climax kind of really asserts itself, because the woodwind instruments and the string instruments, their phrase starts prior, so to be logical. Another more exciting reason comes as well from fugue. So if you've ever composed a fugue, and sometimes you jump to the ending, you have to get it at the ending. You get the last entrance, and then what you do, you don't get the other voices stacked on top. You get the second to last entrance, and you get the third to last entrance. So you have a continuous information, okay? So it's kind of overlapping entrances. So likewise, I think it's going to be more beneficial that we keep getting new material. Notice that the instruments are on a high register. We have flutes doubled by the first violins, which are Debussy. We have clarinets getting in the upper right register, doubled by the violin 2. Notice that we start piano and then we crescendo and get to forte. However, the orchestration does not change. What does that mean? It means you got to make sure it's going to feel balanced the entire time. Luckily, all these instruments are in a very strong register. Most likely at the beginning of this phrase, the woodwinds will dominate because the violins are Debussy, but by the end, it will feel like the strings are really asserting themselves. Also note that when you have a crescendo, an orchestral crescendo, not just like a small expressive one, you basically need the strings, at least the violins, or you just need some strings, because the woodwinds on their own are not going to be enough in volume to convey that kind of change in intensity. The final thing to note here is that the woodwinds and strings are certainly in four-part harmony, but they're in the highest region. So there's less of a risk of that they're going to get covered up because the bias of the human ear is to perceive the higher frequencies more acutely. Now that I've orchestrated the treble texture, I'm actually going to go back and finish orchestrating the bass. So we need to augment the sound of this double bass melody, and the logical place to go to would be the low strings. Notice that we have Debussy cello, and the reason for that is that we have parallel fifths. So you may have thought, okay, well, I'll put the fifth in the cello, and then I'll put the root in the bass. But that's not balanced. First off, we already discussed how harmonically I was hearing that there's less fifth in general, but also there's going to be more cellos to double basses. So make sure. So in this particular case, I have them Debussy. Another possibility, if we look measure 61, is to have the double bass and cellos at the unison, and then the first cello is on the fifth. I think we often forget about this possibility. It often feels like a missed opportunity because it's nice to have double bass and cellos in octaves. It's very satisfying. But there are times where you do have them at the unison. I would suggest, again, studying Debussy's Pelléas et Mélisande to know where they are at the unison, because he's an expert at really doubling in unison. And also to look at Beethoven, Haydn, and Mozart to see when they have the cellos and double basses at the unison. All right, let's orchestrate the next phrase. Notice that we have everyone is playing except for one French horn to begin with is not playing, and we don't have the percussion. I bring in the percussion for the very end. This is a very good technique. It's called bringing in the final voice. It kind of adds a confirmation. Okay, this is the very ending. With orchestration, even when you have loud Tutti passages, it's good to keep a little bit on reserve. Another thing is to think about the actual sounding dynamics. So everyone is basically marked forte. However, it's going to sound fortissimo. Notice that we have a very active bass line, right? Think about Bach when the bass is very intricate and moving around. They're in thick registers. Harmony is moving very quickly. So it's definitely going to sound fortissimo. Likewise, there's a treble texture. They're in a very exciting register, the moneymaker registers, with these flutes up there, clarinets up there. So they as well are going to sound fortissimo. We haven't talked about the middle voices. And then, of course, we bring in the percussion and the crescendo to fortissimo, which will sound as a triple forte. I bring this to your attention because there is a danger of over-orchestrating. For example, I saw a performance of Strauss's Alpine Symphony in France once, in Paris, and it just got way too loud. It could have been the hall. But what happens when the music gets too loud, it hurts your ears and it actually breaks up the form. So instead of getting to these plateaus that are so full and gorgeous, there's these little peaks that break up the attention. So what I recommend is to listen to your piece in context. Okay, go slowly, but also listen from the start up to tempo and make sure that nothing is too loud. I would like to talk about middle voices more, and there's a lot of information you can get from studying the Charles Coquelin Orchestration Manual, but I think I want to keep it at that for now. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.